Hey Wildlings, thank you for joining me today. I had a very different video initially planned that I was going to upload next, but in light of the recent news about Sycamore Gap, I felt after some deep contemplation that it was important to me to share some feelings and musings regarding this horrible news. So for those of you that haven't heard the news or have not heard of Sycamore Gap is a place in Northumberland, which is the county here in the UK that borders England and Scotland. So it is the county right at the top of England, and then Hadrian's Wall crosses through it. The cultural significance and the historical significance are both beautiful and profound to visit. So it attracts hundreds, thousands of visitors every single year, but one of the major draws to the area was known as Sycamore Gap. And Sycamore Gap is essentially a gap in the wall where this grand ancient sycamore was growing. And a reason that it was so well known is that the Sycamore Gap appeared in one of the Hollywood adaptations of the folklore story Robin Hood. So although Hadrian's Wall does not actually sit within the Sherwood Forest area, which is more of the East Midland area of the UK, Sycamore Gap is much further. As I said, it borders Scotland, but it is deeply tied to the collective subconscious in terms of the Robin Hood lore, because we've seen it in this famous adaptation. And so therefore people literally travel to the Sycamore Gap, as my dad took me many years ago, to go and see the grand sycamore tree because of its connections to the Robin Hood film. Now, if you haven't seen the recent news, it was felled criminally in the middle of the night. It is still out for question as to who was the person that committed this horrific crime, but it was felled. An ancient tree that stood tall and proud, and that was a cultural marker and a symbolic image that is deeply rooted into the Celtic folklore in the modern minds of the interpretations of the Robin Hood story. It was destroyed. Now, even people that don't necessarily live a life that is predominantly seeking to be closer to nature, seeking to be more in harmony and to live as close to the earth as possible, they have visited this site, they have memories of this site, they are attracted to this site because of the film and the magic that the film brought into their minds. And so even people that are not practitioners of the craft or are not environmentalists, people are still saddened and shocked to see this grand old tree fall to the ground in a way that is both disrespectful, heartbreaking, and has now left a huge barren gap in the landscape where a once prominent, tall, proud, beautiful and enchanting tree once stood. Now, I visited Sherwood Forest for the first time a couple of months ago. And I guess you could say that I hail from near the Sherwood Forest area. My parents were in the military, so we moved around quite a lot. But my dominant childhood home was nestled not a long drive away from the Sherwood Forest. And that is the Sherwood Forest today, whereas the Sherwood Forest of a few hundred years ago would have likely stretched to where I lived. It's just that it has been so deforested over time that now it is not as large as it once was. So I feel deeply connected to this folklore. So since visiting the forest, I have been on this beautiful journey of coming to an understanding of the ancient roots of the Robin Hood and the Maid Marian story. This is something that has been creeping into my awareness more and more as I've ventured down my own path throughout my own studies as well, and also as a separate face of deity in terms of the green man and the green goddess, or the Lord and the Lady Wildwood. And I'll definitely share more musings on this in another video, but it just seems symbolic to me that the Sycamore Gap has been felled in an act of thoughtless, careless vandalism. We are seeing nature more and more struggling and depleted, but underneath it all, it feels like there is this huge rebellion, very similar to Robin Hood and the Merry Men and Maid Marian of Sherwood Forest. It feels like there is this huge uprising in people that may not have necessarily felt very connected to nature in the past, but now are stepping forth because they've seen an act of something that has really triggered them emotionally, either because they have fond memories of the place, or perhaps the thought-provoking and emotional image of seeing now an empty gap where the sycamore once stood is starting to rally people. And as awful as this act is, and truly it hurts to even think that someone would do it as a joke or do it to make a point, perhaps, in a landscape that is already so sterile here in the UK. The UK is one of the least forested countries in the entire world and is the least forested country in the entirety of Europe. A island that was once covered in a vast expanse of wildwood is now a place where it is difficult to actually find any woodland that you cannot walk through within a matter of a few minutes or a short walk, or even to find veteran trees that are large enough for you to look up as an adult and stand in awe because of their beauty and their grandeur. So much of that has been lost from the British Isles now. And the sycamore was almost a symbol of the old world and what once was, and to see that gap now where it once stood, it's almost triggering within people a remembering of that loss, a remembering of what we once had and how the landscape once looked. It may just be a single tree, but it represented more than that. It represented our deep-rooted Celtic connections to the Robin Hood lore and the story of our ancestors and how they were a forest people. The Celtic people of Britain were actually a rainforest people. We had a vast rainforest, a temperate Atlantic rainforest that stretched from the low west coast all the way up to the Highlands of Scotland along the west coast of the UK. We were a rainforest people, and just as our modern communities have destroyed the tropical rainforest, we also deforested our own. Now, people don't even realise this because we go out into our countryside and all we see is a sterile, lifeless, treeless landscape. And there's actually a thing in ecology which we call shifting baseline syndrome. And this is the idea that the more time goes on and the more biodiversity that we lose, the more we look out into our landscape and think that what we are looking at is actually the standard baseline of where nature should be. So the more that I venture into working with the archetypes of Robin Hood and Maid Marian, and the further that I go down on my path communicating and working with the green folk in reverence and respect, the more that I feel the lore of this story is so important. It represents the very quiet but sometimes loud fight for justice that ordinary men and women will be willing to fight for. Not only can Robin Hood and Maid Marian be seen as faces of the Lady and the Lord of Greenwood, the Lord and Lady Wildwood, the Green Man, the Green Goddess, but they can also be related to on a human level in the sense of a fight for injustice, a fight for protecting what is pure and true in a world that is often run by greed and consumerism. And it reminds us to lean back into standing up for each other and standing up for the voiceless and standing up for the wildwood. So I didn't really have a aim or a plan for this video, but I just felt like I had to put something out there and maybe even shed light on the situation for people that might be in other countries that haven't heard the news of what happened. I also wanted to invite you, even if you are not a practitioner of the craft, to simply light a candle, and as you light this candle, just hold in your heart space and hold in your mind's eye the sycamore as she stood once tall and proud in the gap of Hadrian's Wall, and the image of her being cruelly felled in the middle of the night, and to send love and healing and justice for this act. Because if the person that has done this does not get reprimanded for their actions, how many more people feel who have no value on nature? How many more of them feel like they can just go out and vandalize these ancient trees that we have so little of in our landscape now here in Britain? How many more kids just playing around, thinking they're being funny or being egged on by their friends? Or again, people who are living in a world that is removed from this way of looking at things. How many more veteran trees are we going to lose? There is already very, very little protection in the legal system for ancient woodland and veteran trees. So I'm not even sure if the person that has done it will actually get reprimanded. I think the only reason that they will do, if they do, is because I think it's classed as an ancient heritage site or something along those lines, and that is afforded protection. The sycamore in that landscape would have offered a huge amount of ecological value to the wildlife in that local area, and surely that has its own worth. I really hope you enjoyed this video, Wildlings, and if you did, please don't forget to subscribe to join us here on the channel where we explore green witchcraft and hedge witchcraft, and I hope I will see you in our next video.